Thank you. You're so good to me, Jimmy, except when we play Words with Friends. All right, now we can get started. How many people have read this book, The China Study? Who could read it? How many people have attempted to read it? Hands up. Okay. How many people have not read it, but you've looked online for reasons that it's wrong because you don't want it to be true? Okay, well, there we go. So that's probably how maybe you found my blog, or there's some other critiques out there that are wonderful, like by Chris Masterjohn and Anthony Colpo. And has anyone here just never actually even heard of this book before, and this is kind of new to you? Couple people. So obviously you do not have any vegan friends on Facebook. Otherwise you would know by now that this book is the bane of your existence. So we're going to talk a little bit about it. The China Study, it was written by T. Colin Campbell, who's the professor emeritus at Cornell University. And this is not just any professor emeritus off the street. He is very credentialed. He has over 300 scientific publications, and he has worked for 40 years as a researcher. So he holds a lot of weight in the scientific community just because of all of his experience. And the book itself is 417 pages, and for some reason a lot of people think the book is actually peer-reviewed, but it's not. It's published by Ben Bella Books, which puts out other titles like The Psychology of the Simpsons and You're Not Supposed to Talk About Fight Club, and a lot of pop culture stuff. So it's kind of interesting that his book got lumped in with this particular publisher. And the book, it's named after the China Study, which I'll talk about in a minute, but this particular book was called The Grand Prix of Epidemiology by the New York Times, and if you read that the first time like me and you're like, what's the Grand Prix? That sounds painful. That actually means it's the grand prize. It's a word in French, and it just means it's like this really amazing thing that we should all be in awe of. And while I was actually doing research for this, I came across an interesting summary of the China Study where someone said the book is more talked about than actually read, which I thought was so true because even people who use this thing to prove their point often haven't even read the book itself. So let's move on. This is some of what the China Study tells us is true. First thing, which I think will probably not jive with a lot of people in this crowd, is that animal protein promotes cancer growth like a carcinogen. And in fact, yeah, yeah, that's unfortunate if it would be true. And we're going to talk about that, why it's not true. But Campbell himself has actually said that certain proteins like casein in milk should actually be qualified and classified as carcinogens. So it's a little extreme, but a lot of people have read this book and come away completely believing it's true. The book also blames animal products in any form, doesn't matter if it's grass-fed, free-range, whatever. All of it, no matter what, is going to contribute to chronic disease. Things like cancer, heart disease, diabetes, obesity, you name it, animal products are the cause. So you can kind of see by now why vegans really like this book and why you guys probably don't. And Campbell also strongly opposes low-carb diets, and he has a lot of reasons for that. And for anyone who's ever been on Amazon.com and you know how they have reviews that you post and then you can comment on the reviews, if you go to any of the Atkins books, you will find a review from Campbell that has like 400 comments after it, which he's participating in, arguing with people, which is, if you ever want to just kill a day or 4 or a week, just, you can go online and you can watch this, and it's almost like a sitcom in some sense. So I don't know how he has time to do that, but it seems like one of his hobbies, so if, all right. And so I mentioned this earlier. It's named after the China Study, which is a 20-year epidemiological project that Campbell was the director of. So that's where the title of the book comes from, even though the entire book itself is not only about the China Study. So what is the China Study? And I have to say that as an English major, writing study just killed me. It's like Rio Grande River, but this is how I'm distinguishing the China Study from the actual study itself, the book versus the study. So it's also called the China Cornell Oxford Project, and it's an observational study of 65 rural counties in China with 1,000 people in each county that they observed and took data from. And then they compiled and averaged all the values for each county so that we ended up with 65 data points. So it's actually, even though it's a huge study, we actually don't have that many data points for it, which is not a great thing in terms of statistical analysis, but it is what we have to work for, and it's actually a very well done study in most respects. And so the mortality data for the study was taken from the 1970s, and the rest was from the early 1980s. And as I mentioned, this is an epidemiological study. Is it all right? We all right? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And does anyone know what epidemiology is? Have some idea? A couple people? Yeah. So the technical breakdown of it is the study of things that can never, ever, 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 ever prove cause and effect. If you look it up in the dictionary, it should say this, but it usually doesn't. That's a shame because this is kind of the truth. But if we actually break down the word, it's epi, which means upon or on. Like, does anyone remember being in 3rd grade and someone said, oh, your epidermis is showing, and you were like mortified because you had no idea what that was? Remember that? Epi is like on you, your skin is on you. And then dem is people. So epidemiology is the study of what is upon the people. It's the study of disease in populations. But epidemiology is observational, which means we don't actually manipulate variables to see what is causing what. We just take a bunch of data and we see, okay, this is happening, they're kind of happening at the same time. We don't really know why, but there you have it. So the unfortunate part of this type of field of study is that it catches fire in the media. Whenever we have an epidemiological study come out that shows, meat is causing cancer in people, or that it's associated with cancer or something, everyone assumes correlation equals causation, which is just not true. The things that we see in epidemiology can never prove cause and effect. So we know right away that the China study itself cannot prove cause and effect. So what?
Right away?
Right away? Oh my goodness, right after I told you I was an English major too. Okay, well, let's just pretend that was a pun, okay? Anyway, so just ignore that word. And since this isn't a controlled study, great. Since this isn't a controlled experiment, there's nothing in the China study that is actually proving anything. So just keep that in mind as we're talking today. So all this data was taken and it was published in a 900-page book called Diet, Lifestyle, and Mortality in China. And this is a really hard book to find, I know, because I looked for a long time to find it. And it's basically just page after page after page of numbers. Correlations between all the variables. Numbers, scrolls of them. If you like numbers, it's beautiful. If you hate math, it is terrifying. So a lot of people ask me, for those of you who don't know yet, I did a lengthy critique of this particular book and the study. And for some reason, my, purpose of doing this critique is often shrouded in mystery or suspicion, because people ask me all the time if I'm funded by the meat industry or the dairy industry, or if I even exist, and I don't even know. I really don't know how that would work, but I thought I would just tell you really quickly, also get my water. I thought I'd tell you really quickly just my own intention for this. And I am a recovered vegan/vegetarian. Thank you. It was a long, grueling process. And for those of you who've never heard any of my background, I was actually a vegetarian for 10 years. I started when I was 7 years old. And I gave up meat at that point in my life, and my parents thought it was a phase. I guess it was a phase, but it lasted a long time. And by the time I was in my early teens, I had gone to veganism, and then by the time I was about 14, 15, I was a raw vegan. And does anyone know what raw veganism is? I was living on fruits and vegetables, and I was so entrenched in this dogma that I thought my diet was the healthiest thing they could possibly be eating, because fruits and vegetables are so healthy, right? So why not just eat fruits and vegetables? So here I was, 16 years old. All of a sudden, my health was falling apart, and the breaking moment for me came actually when I was 17 and in the dentist office for my yearly cleanup. And I should mention that I'm the kind of person who, when I was little, at sleepovers, I would be the kid laying wide awake, like unable to sleep because I hadn't brushed my teeth, because I would feel so bad. Like all the other kids would be passed out in a sugar coma, and I would like sneak out into the hallway to floss in secrecy, because that's how dedicated I was to my dental health. So I hadn't had almost any problems for my entire life. I had taken great care of my teeth. Here I was, 17 years old, back in the dentist chair, waiting for my glowing report. And all of a sudden, the dentist started making comments and noises that you really don't want to hear from a dentist, like, ooh, oh. You know, so I was getting really worried. And by the end of the dentist visit, I found out I had 16 cavities. And that's a ballpark figure, because there were so many cavities, they were growing on top of each other. They were just, and at 17, you know, so it's at that point that I realized I really needed to make some changes. So I started investigating just nutrition in general, and I ended up coming across Weston A. Price material. Heard some clapping. We have some Weston A. Price fans. Yeah, great stuff. I really owe them a tremendous amount. So at that point, I ended up transitioning back to an omnivorous diet, and I restored my health. So that's my quick story right there, and that's kind of why I was interested in vegan subjects and things like the China study to begin with, because I have a very long history in that community. And so when I came across this book, it really didn't fit with my experience as a vegan or my understanding of human history and physiology, which obviously includes a lot of animal product consumption, because we have never been vegans. It just doesn't make sense to me that that would be our optimal diet. So I was a little suspicious of the book the first time I read it, but that's not when I actually critiqued it, because this was back in, I think, 2006. And eventually I decided I wanted to see for myself whether the claims in the book were actually legitimate. I wanted to see if the things that were being said here and that people were throwing over my head as, you know, this is why veganism is the best, I wanted to see if that was true. And because I'm curious like that. So I also wanted to just win at the internet, because I used to have this issue where I would like to invite unnecessary aggravation into my life, and I would do that by hanging out on vegan message boards and getting in debates with people about why veganism wasn't optimal. So there came a point where I just got so sick of people using this book as the last word. They were just like, whatever I'd say, they'd say, well, just read the China study, because that makes you wrong. And so this kind of sums up how I was feeling for a while. And there was a particular message board that I used to hang out on that I will not name names, but it promotes a very large consumption of bananas. Some of you might know what I'm talking about. And I was getting into some big fights on that site. I mean, just debates on that site with a particular person, and he was very set in his ways about this China study being true. So it was at that point where I decided to track down this book and go over the data myself. I had, due to life circumstances, which I won't go into at the moment, I had some extra time. I had some insurance money from a car accident I was in. So I was like, well, I'm going to take a few months, and I'm just going to be a nerd, and I'm going to look at all these numbers in this giant book, and I'm going to see what they say, because that sounded fun to me. Are we? That's okay. So I got this book. Again, I spent 2 to 3 months daily just poring over the numbers, bookmarking it, dog-earing, typing things out on my computer, running some statistical analysis on it. And what I found was none of the claims in the book seemed to match the data. And there was such a stark difference between what the raw data said and what the book said the data said, that I was just stunned. And I was like, I have to do something about this. I have to put this online for people to read. At the time, I had this little blog called Raw Food SOS, which I still have. And I had originally started it to help raw vegans recover their health, because I didn't think they were getting the right information from their community. So I posted this on the internet, a long critique of everything I had found about the book that I found to be wrong. And at the time, I expected maybe a couple people to read it, because my blog had a readership of maybe 5 people a day, and I think 4 of those were my mother on different computers. So I was going to be really excited if more than that read anything on my blog. So I posted it online, and indeed, it got viral. It went viral on the internet almost overnight. Thanks to the help of a lot of different paleo bloggers and low-carb bloggers, it was dispersed over the internet, and my blog went from about 5 to 10 views a day to 20,000 overnight in one night. And eventually the author Colin Campbell caught wind of my critique, and he apparently slapped me down on vegsource.com, as you can see. And if you've ever been to VegSource, you'll understand that it's a very pro-vegan site. So we got in a little online debate for a while, and I ended up writing a couple more kind of reviews and critiques of his work. And I think eventually he decided it was just more fun to hang out on Amazon.com review threads than talk to me. So he kind of disappeared. And so that's the brief history of how I did this and how I came to be on this stage today. So, water. So one of the things I noticed as I was analyzing this data and comparing it to what Campbell was saying was that Campbell repeatedly made the claim in his book that animal products were like just almost well, not perfectly, but the direction of the data was pointing that animal foods were correlated with diseases, Western diseases like heart disease, cancer, diabetes. And from reading the book, the impression I took was that the data was generally all pointing in this direction, and that it was something that was clear-cut, like that animal products were clearly linked to disease. So what I discovered was that Campbell was actually doing something kind of sneaky. He was saying that, okay, in the data we have higher cholesterol is associated with Western diseases, which it can be confounded by a lot of things, but there was a slight trend towards this. It wasn't perfect at all. And then on top of this, he was saying, well, animal protein in the data is associated with higher cholesterol. And so in the book, he was saying, therefore, animal protein must be correlated with Western diseases because we have this chain of variables. But when I looked in the data, the animal protein was not associated with any disease. The people who were eating more animal protein were not getting sicker. There was something else confounding the cholesterol connection there that made it look to Campbell like there was a link there. But if people who are eating more animal protein weren't the ones getting more disease, how can you say that they are? So this was the first thing that really baffled me, and it's one thing that I wrote a lot about on my critique. What I deduced from that was that cholesterol is not a direct marker for animal food consumption. I'm sure a lot of you have experienced maybe even your cholesterol going down or changing and becoming better as you're on a higher animal product diet. It's not something that's completely linear where you're vegan and your cholesterol is low and you're an omnivore and your cholesterol is high. It just doesn't work that way. So Campbell kind of assumed that it did, which I think was a big problem in the book. And in the data, the non-fish animal protein, which is stuff from like meat, eggs, and dairy, it had no statistically significant association with any disease, none at all. And it was negatively correlated with most cancers, which means that people eating more of this kind of protein were actually getting less cancer than everybody else. And we didn't hear about that in the China study book. And fish protein was the only thing that had anything kind of funky about it, and it was strongly associated with liver cancer. But the fish-eating regions were near water, which is like kind of humid regions, and this is where hepatitis B and aflatoxin, which is a carcinogen that causes liver cancer, that's where it proliferates. So it's kind of a question of, okay, are you going to blame the fish for this, or are you, sorry, you going to fix me? Okay. Am I a cat?
No, it's it's not staying in.
It's not staying? Okay. We're having technical difficulties. Do you have a question?
Yeah. Is the China study based on that book?
The China study, the book itself, it has one chapter based on this China study, and the rest of it is a compilation of some other things I'll be talking about a little bit later in the presentation. But it's called the China study. I think that was the publisher's decision, and I don't think actually Campbell was going to call it that originally. So it's kind of misleading because the entire book is not just about the China study.
But the part that's from Chinese statistics comes from that book?
Yeah, that blue book, that's all the China study itself. Yeah, the China study. Yeah, you're very welcome. Okay, are we good?
I need duct tape.
That's okay.
We have duct tape. $1
See
in.
the
Okay.
screen behind you?
Oh, sorry guys, I didn't realize it was flickering like that. Could be. Okay, well, I'll keep talking, I guess. So fish protein was only associated with that one kind of cancer, and apart from that, for the most part, fish was associated negatively with most diseases. So people who were eating more fish were living longer, getting less disease. Overall, they were healthier. Yet, nonetheless, fish is one of the foods that we're supposed to eliminate based on the China study. Go figure. We good now? Thank you very much for your taping. Thank you for fixing me. Now, here's the really interesting part. Plant protein has more positive associations with cancer than animal protein does, including with colon cancer and leukemia. So this is from the raw data. This is something that's in the book, that blue book of statistics and correlations, and it's not something that we heard about in the China study book. And this is also interesting. You would think that out of everything, based on what we hear just by conventional wisdom, that meat products and animal protein would maybe be associated with heart disease, because that's what we're told all the time. These foods cause heart disease. In the China study data, the correlation between fish, or for animal protein that didn't come from fish, and heart disease was 0.01, which is almost, for anyone who has a statistical background, this is almost perfectly neutral. There's no relationship whatsoever. And the correlation between fish protein and heart disease was actually slightly inverse, which means that people eating more fish were getting less heart disease. And the people who are eating more plant protein were actually getting more heart disease. Go figure. Now, this is kind of my favorite part. Hold on. Yeah. So one of the most interesting things that came out of this, from my perspective, and it was actually not something I even harped on too much in my first critique of the book, was that out of every single food, remember there are 367 variables that were measured. Out of every single food that was documented in the China study, wheat had the strongest correlation with heart disease and stroke. It was astronomically high. It was higher than any other food and any other disease, which baffled me. So this was also interesting. Wheat also had the strongest association with BMI, body mass index, out of any food. And this is something that persisted even after I tried adjusting for calorie intake, activity level, macronutrient ratios, and other foods. I have no explanation for this, and I'll say once more that correlation isn't causation, so this isn't proof that wheat is going to kill you or make you fat and give you heart disease. But it is super interesting, because this correlation was so much stronger than anything that had anything to do with animal products, yet this was completely left out of the China study book. And I found this really interesting. In one of those critiques that Campbell wrote of my critique, which I flashed earlier on the VegSource website, he wrote, in response to what I wrote about pointing out this strong correlation about wheat, he said, "The correlation of wheat flour and heart disease is interesting, but I am not aware of any prior and biologically plausible and convincing evidence to support an hypothesis that wheat causes these diseases." So basically he's saying, well, that's interesting, but I've never heard of that before. We don't have any evidence. So imagine my surprise when I found this paper by Campbell himself, written in 1996. Significant differences in the diet of rural Chinese population studied suggest that wheat consumption may promote higher insulin, higher triglycerides, and lower sex hormone binding globulin, which is a marker of insulin resistance. Such a profile is consistent with that commonly associated with obesity, dyslipidemia, diabetes, hypertension, heart disease. So, I don't know. This was 2010, this was 1996. I don't know what happened in those 14 years to make this paper completely disappear from memory, but there it is in a peer-reviewed journal nonetheless. Brain fog, that must be it. Maybe I had a lot of, maybe it was too much wheat causing brain fog. It could have been a lot of things. And this was a little bit more about it. So he said there were no biologically plausible mechanisms that he knew of. He actually wrote about some biologically plausible mechanisms in this very paper. And he wrote, I'll just I don't want to just read quotes all day, but this is, I found what was interesting. The effect of rice and wheat on sex hormone binding globulin was remarkable and unexpected. Nevertheless, there is some evidence to suggest that rice and wheat can have significantly different effects on the biochemical variables we measured. Wheat may be unique in its relative capacity to stimulate insulin. The relative differences in the fatty acid proportions and amylose content for wheat and rice may be thus responsible for modulating serum, sex hormone binding globulin, I mixed those letters up, triglycerides, and insulin. So he was already writing about possible mechanisms that involved wheat. I just found it astounding that this was actually one of his peer-reviewed papers, and it just received absolutely no mention in the China study book. I mean, there wasn't a single bad thing said about wheat. And again, this isn't proving causation, but the fact that he relied so heavily on the China study data to prove his animal protein causes heart disease and cancer stuff, and used so many kind of sneaky chains of variables to prove that, and yet ignored this direct, astounding correlation, that really disturbed me. Now let's look at a few other papers that were spawned by the China study data. And I wanted to put this up because a lot of the criticism I receive is that I'm an English major and therefore I don't know how to read scientific papers and I'm probably just making stuff up. And again, maybe I don't even exist, so how could I write a critique? Actually about a year after I wrote my first critique, I put out a second post that I don't think as many people read, but I compiled everything I could find about the China study data that had been written by actual researchers. And I was thinking, well, okay, is this stuff that actually supports what Campbell wrote about in his book? So this is some of the stuff I found. This was pretty awesome. Within China, neither plasma total cholesterol nor LDL cholesterol was associated with cardiovascular disease. So here we have, this is a paper by Campbell himself, where he's saying that cholesterol was not associated with heart disease in the China study data, which is a blatant contradiction of what we read in the book. The results indicate that geographical differences in cardiovascular disease mortality within China are caused primarily by factors other than dietary or plasma cholesterol. Maybe wheat has something to do with that. I don't know. I don't want to make assumptions, but I thought that was pretty interesting. And this is another example of how his research has been misinterpreted, usually by himself, I think. And I also want to say, I don't want to pick on Campbell too much, because I really don't like to make science personal, and I'm kind of poking fun of it right now, but in all honesty, if he ever wanted to eat a salad with me, I would totally be happy to talk with him. So I just wanted to get that out there. This is what he wrote, or what was written in a review by him. He wrote that animal protein, including that from dairy products, may leach more calcium from the bones than is ingested. How many people have heard this claim before? It's pretty common among vegans. And he said, so this was talking about a specific paper that was based on the China study data using just a couple counties. So Campbell and other researchers analyzed the role of dietary calcium in bone density by following closely the diets of 800 women from 5 counties that have very different diets in China. Analyses of the data suggest that increased levels of animal-based proteins, including protein from dairy products, almost certainly contribute to a significant loss of bone calcium, while vegetable-based diets clearly protect against bone loss, Campbell reported. Just remember that as we look at this next thing. So I looked up the actual study that he was talking about, that he published. The results strongly indicated that dietary calcium, especially from dairy sources, increased bone mass in middle-aged and elderly women by facilitating optimal peak bone mass earlier in life. Calcium from dairy sources was correlated with bone variables to a higher degree than was calcium from non-dairy sources. So this is almost perfectly opposite of what he reported in the Cornell Chronicle article. And I think it's an ongoing unfortunate thing, because so much of the data in the China study is fascinating, and I think that it could be a great place to start to look for more, or look for ideas for further experiments that might be able to clarify what's going on with it. But the fact that most people only see the China study book version of the China study means that much of this data, much of the findings are never going to see the light of day. So unless you're actually surfing PubMed and being a nerd and that sort of thing, it's likely that you will never hear about this anywhere. Unfortunate. Here's another good one by Campbell himself. It is the largely vegetarian inland communities who have the greatest all-risk mortalities and morbidities, and who have the lowest LDL cholesterols. It could well be that there is a minimum level of LDL cholesterol below which cell membranes are adversely affected. Now, this contradicts something that's a very popular idea within the plant-based or vegan communities, which is that if your cholesterol is below 150, total cholesterol below 150, you're said to be heart attack proof, which first of all isn't true, but it's also something that is parroted so often that a lot of people believe it is. And I think that the fact that Colin Campbell pointed out this in one of his own articles is really important, because yes, your cholesterol can be too low, and yes, that can cause problems. And it appears that in the China study data, it was the people with the lowest cholesterol that were actually the unhealthiest. So, and this, who knows who Walter Willett or Frank Hu are? Yeah, pretty famous researchers. They wrote in, this is also a peer-reviewed letter to, I forget which journal, but it was called Reply to T.C. Campbell. And they both wrote, a survey of 65 counties in rural China, which is the China study, did not find a clear association between animal product consumption and risk of heart disease or major cancers. So there we have Walter Willett and Frank Hu. If you don't want to listen to me, listen to these guys. These guys are saying the same thing. The China study data did not show an association between these things. Okay, now the other part of the China study that tends to get a lot of attention is Campbell's rat research. And this is something that started, it was inspired when he was working in the Philippines in the 70s. And he caught wind of a study that some Indian researchers were doing where they were feeding rats different levels of the protein casein, which is one of the major milk proteins. And what they were doing in this experiment was they were exposing two groups of rats to high levels of aflatoxin, which is a carcinogen that when your liver detoxifies it, it can become a carcinogenic metabolite, and it can basically cause liver cancer. So what these researchers were finding was that when they exposed these rats to high levels of aflatoxin and then fed one group 5% casein and another group 20% casein, the 5% group was actually staying free from cancer, whereas the 20% casein group was getting cancer. So Campbell started wondering at this point, does animal protein cause cancer? And notice that he leapt from casein, a very specific, isolated, refined protein, to all animal protein in general. So that's kind of a big leap. So according to the China study, anyway, I actually missed a step. Campbell ended up replicating a lot of this research because he was so fascinated by it. So he for many years, he was working with rats, doing the same kind of aflatoxin and casein study experiments, and he was finding pretty much the same thing, that when the rats were fed a very low level of casein, they were staying free from cancer, and the ones that were getting more protein were getting cancer. So we're led to believe that just animal protein in general could turn cancer on and off. Oh, that shouldn't say Campbell, that should say cancer. Could turn a cancer on. Freudian slip. Oh, okay. Could turn cancer on and off like a switch. That's just a casein. Okay. Just by varying the amount of casein he fed them. So this is a very kind of disturbing thing to think about. It's like, wow, is the amount of animal protein I eat affecting my risk of getting cancer? And so the takeaway from the book is that yes, it is, and you should be not eating you should be limiting your animal protein intake to very small amounts if you eat it at all. So Campbell declares that the milk protein casein is a potent carcinogen. So here we are talking about an actual food substance, casein, something that is in breast milk that we all consumed as a child, and it's apparently a carcinogen. Scary stuff. So according to Campbell, in other studies that he conducted using plant protein in place of casein, he discovered that when he used gluten and soy protein instead of casein, actually in neither case, even at 20% levels, none of the rats were getting cancer. So from that, he concluded that all animal protein must be contributing to cancer growth, and all plant protein must be protecting against it. And what he didn't tell us in the book is that when he restored the missing amino acids in the plant protein, they behaved exactly like casein, and the rats started getting cancer again, which means that it's not something specific about animal protein that was promoting cancer growth. It was just having complete amino acids, because that is what actually promotes cell growth in general, including that of tumors. So this was a nice little thing to leave out from the book, because anyone who is even a vegan is going to be getting complete protein if they're eating multiple kinds of foods each day. You can't get around it. So his experiments don't necessarily have much relevance to real life, especially if you're not a rat eating a refined diet from birth until death. So now this was really interesting. And it's actually something that I didn't put in my original critique. So if you didn't read my Forks Over Knives critique, actually, did anyone in here read my Forks Over Knives critique? Oh, wow, cool. This is something I found later, and I really wish that I had found it earlier and I could have put it in my first one because it was fascinating. But so in India, along with these researchers doing experiments on rats, there are researchers doing the same kind of experiment, almost identical, with monkeys. And so this was in the 1980s, and they were doing the same study. They're they're exposing the monkeys to aflatoxin, feeding them different levels of protein, and seeing what happened. Except the one difference was that with the rat studies, they're using a huge amount of aflatoxin. Like they're just exposing the rats to almost impossible amounts that would never happen in real life. But, oopsie. But there's one study that was done on monkeys that instead of feeding this huge dose of or exposing them to a huge dose of aflatoxin, they're exposing them to daily smaller doses of aflatoxin, which is what would happen if you were living in an area that had aflatoxin-contaminated food and you're eating a little bit with each meal. So this actually resembles something that could happen in real life. So as with Campbell's rats, one group of monkeys got 5% of their diet as casein, and the other got 20%. Can you guess what happened in this case? The low-protein monkeys died. What happened to the high-protein monkeys eating all that animal protein? They were fine. They were fine. So these results are almost completely opposite of what Campbell found using his less realistic animal experiments. And what it shows is that it's actually the level of aflatoxin that kind of influences what happens once you're feeding different diets or different levels of casein. And the real quick version of what's going on is that when you're eating a protein-deficient diet, your liver, enzyme activity in your liver decreases, and basically you can't detoxify the things you're eating. So if you're exposed to aflatoxin and you're eating a protein-deficient diet, instead of your body detoxifying the aflatoxin and turning it into carcinogenic metabolites, what happens is it just stays in your body as a toxic thing, and it creates liver damage. And so in some cases, like with these poor guys, they were having such severe liver damage from their low-protein diet that they just died. They died before they could get cancer, whereas these guys were still healthy enough to live and actually not even get cancer. So Campbell's research and this idea that animal protein itself is some kind of switch for turning on and off cancer growth, it's a complete misrepresentation of what the actual research is. And unfortunately, this one part of the book really has scared a lot of people away from eating animal products because it seems so convincing on the surface. So that's quite unfortunate. So bottom line, in Campbell's rat studies, the rats were exposed to massive levels of aflatoxin, which is the equivalent of eating at least 80,000 jars of aflatoxin-contaminated peanut butter in one sitting. I mean, peanut butter tastes great, but how many people could actually eat that much? I mean, it's okay, you can raise your hand, I won't judge. Thank you for your honesty back there, I appreciate it. And thank you actually to Chris Masterjohn for this statistic too, because he wrote some great papers on this. And the monkey study, on the other hand, was using lower aflatoxin dose that mimicked what would happen in real life. So you can kind of see that if we're going to look at any of these experiments and say, well, does this have any relevance to real life? It would be the monkey experiment where the low-protein monkeys were the ones dying. So there we go. The more realistic study actually showed the benefits of animal protein. Go figure. So I think this is just really important to remember. If anyone out there ever gets slammed over the head with a China study book and by a vegan who's trying to convince you that animal protein is causing cancer, just remember this research and remember that Campbell's research was not something that can really have a direct application to real life because it just can't. Sorry, Mouse. So here's just a summary of everything we've talked about so far. China study data. Animal foods were not directly associated with most diseases in the raw data. That just bottom line, that it just wasn't there. And even so, I think in the China study book there was a problem of mistaking correlation with causation. Just because there's an association in observational data, it doesn't mean that one thing is causing another. We can never tell that unless we actually take an experiment into a controlled setting and manipulate variables and manipulate variables and see what exactly is causing what, how it's all linked together. And the peer-reviewed research does not support the claims in the China study book. Even if you don't want to listen to me because I'm an English major and I spelled right W-R-I-T-E when I meant R-I-G-H-T, I know that just totally ruined my credibility. I'm so sorry. You don't have to listen to me. You can actually look up the original papers that were based on the China study data, and it says the same thing. Campbell was not correctly, I guess, expressing the research of the China study. And same goes for his rat research. It was a distortion of reality in many ways. And lastly, the extrapolation of the effects of casein to all animal protein. I didn't mention this too much, but we have examples of, say, whey protein. How many people have heard about the anti-cancer properties of whey protein? It's in just a huge number of studies have shown that whey protein actually has great immunological properties, and it really is health boosting, and there's absolutely no evidence that that kind of protein contributes to cancer. So why are we assuming that casein is a good representation of every single kind of animal protein in existence? That just doesn't make sense. So I do want to say just a couple nice things about the China study, because I don't like this to be all mean, because I'm kind of a nice person sometimes. So, so the good is that the China study argues that most modern diseases are influenced by diet. And I think that this is something that probably most people in here can agree with, because I'm sure many of you have started out with some kind of chronic condition that you've seen improve with diet. And for people to kind of make the connection that what you eat really, really does influence your life. It influences how well you can live it. It influences how well you just feel every day. I think that a lot of people don't realize how strong that connection is. And so just the fact that this book kind of gets that idea out there, maybe that's a good thing, even if the rest of it's not so good. And it promotes a whole foods diet free from refined sugar, refined grains, and industrial oils, which I think probably most people in this audience avoid most of those things anyway. So that's actually one commonality that Campbell has with low-carb diets and paleo diets, is the elimination of a lot of these refined carbohydrates. So my hypothesis is that that probably has something to do with the benefits that a lot of people see when they first switch to plant-based whole foods diets. Is that it's not because they're ditching the meat, it's because they're ditching all these other foods. And it also highlights the role of food industries and big pharma in dictating our health and guidelines, which is of special interest to me because I'm actually writing a book right now called Death by Food Pyramid, and it's going over. Thank you. I'm excited about it. There's some cool stuff that I'm going to put in it, and I think it's something that not everyone realizes when you look at the ADA or the American, even the American Heart Association. So much of what they write and what they publish is actually sponsored by food industries, and it's disgusting. You'll read a handout sheet about the benefit or the pros and cons of soda, and it'll be sponsored by Pepsi. And most people don't even realize this, and they don't realize that what we conceive of as conventional wisdom is based so much on profit. It's based on keeping our economy afloat by promoting these really unhealthy but highly profitable foods. And I just think it's nice that this book at least addresses that and kind of brings it to the surface, the fact that so much of what we think we know about health is actually funded by something. So even if there's nothing else too fantastic in the book, maybe we can just agree on these points. So, and that's it. And I wanted to leave a few minutes if anyone has any questions, because I thought maybe a couple of people might. I already saw some hands up. So thank you for listening, and I hope you learned something from this. All right. Do I have to leave? Do I have to leave, or do we have time for questions? Okay, anyone have any questions? 3 minutes. Okay, 3 minutes for questions. Anybody have a question? Oh, yeah.
Denise, did I read somewhere when you said online that when you changed your diet, the color of your eyes changed?
Yeah, actually.
Can you repeat the question for him?
Oh, yeah. She asked, when I made a dietary change, I saw the color of my eyes change. And yes, this actually happened when I became a raw foodist. And I think it has something to do with glutathione, because it has something to do with, I forget the exact way this works, but if you have a very high glutathione level or something, it interferes with melanin production, I think. Does anyone know anything about this, actually? Because it's not something I've researched too much, because I haven't actually been that interested in the explanation. But when I did switch to a raw food diet, my eyes went from kind of a darker brown to greenish hazel. And it's actually something that a lot of raw foodists report. And I'm not sure that anyone really understands why that happens, but it is kind of interesting. So I don't know if that answers your question at all. Sorry. Yeah.
What would you say to vegetarians who say that their diet is more sustainable for the planet rather than pasturing cows?
I would say, actually, I would point them to a book called Meat, a Benign Extravagance by Simon Fairley. And I recommend this book to everyone because it is so well researched. And it blows that idea apart. It shows that most of the data that those kinds of arguments come from, it's really warped or it's miscalculated. And if you actually look at the reality of our food systems, probably the most sustainable one is decentralized agriculture, where we do have animals, eating on land that's unsuitable for planting crops and such forth. So again, it's the book called Meat, a Benign Extravagance by Simon Fairley. And I would just say, read that book, and then you don't have to argue with them anymore. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, wasn't Campbell using oxidized casing first?
I'm not sure what kind of casing he was using, but it was highly refined, and there is some evidence that isolated casing itself may be more problematic, again, just in the isolated sense, than other forms of protein. So that's another problem with extrapolating it to all forms of animal protein. But it's one of those things where when it's working in synergy with the actual whole food component in milk, the effects are completely different. So you really can't say anything based on these refined studies, the refined diets. So, yeah. Okay, thank you so much.